Hey guys, tonight we begin with a collection of disasters so impressively unfortunate that even medieval people, who already lived one bad decision away from catastrophe, had to stop and think, this feels excessive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this quiet tour through humanity's worst timing. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Ideally somewhere stable, structurally speaking. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the year 1184, a group of very important men gathered in the German city of Erfurt. Nobles, knights, imperial officials. Men who owned land, commanded armies, and likely believed the world rested quite comfortably beneath their feet. It did not. The meeting itself was meant to resolve a dispute within the Holy Roman Empire. Tense, political, mildly passive-aggressive, exactly the kind of gathering where people nod politely while planning each other's downfall. Voices were raised, positions were defended, pride was involved. And beneath all of that was a cesspit. The event, now known as the Erfurt latrine disaster, began with a sound that no medieval noble was trained to interpret. A slow, tired creaking. The wooden floor, already weakened by time, moisture, and what we can politely call poor long-term planning, finally decided it had hosted enough politics for one lifetime. Then it gave up. The floor collapsed without warning, sending dozens of armoured men crashing downward into the pit below. And here, the laws of physics became deeply personal. Armour, which had always been excellent for surviving swords, proved significantly less helpful when falling into a confined space filled with human waste. Panic followed. Naturally, some men tried to climb out only to be pulled back by others equally desperate. Others simply vanished beneath the surface. It was chaos, confusion, and a level of indignity rarely recorded in official history. There were no heroic last stands, no inspiring speeches, just a lot of very important people realizing far too late that their day had taken a terrible turn. A few survived, which is impressive, though one suspects they immediately reconsidered every decision that led them to that room. Among the fortunate was Henry VI, Holy Roman Emperor, who avoided the collapse by staying near a window, a rare example of medieval architecture accidentally saving a life instead of ending one. What makes this disaster remarkable isn't just the deaths, it's the complete lack of dignity. These were powerful men, accustomed to control, reduced in seconds to victims of gravity, bad engineering, and centuries of accumulated neglect. History often remembers kings for their victories, their laws, their legacies. In this case, it remembers a meeting, a flaw, and a very unfortunate landing. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman stepped into the street and began to dance. Not gracefully, not joyfully, not even rhythmically, just persistently. Her name is often recorded as Frau Trophäa, and for reasons no one fully understood, then or now, she kept dancing. For hours, then days. No music, no celebration, no obvious reason. Just a growing sense that something had gone very wrong inside either her mind, her body, or possibly the entire city. At first, people watched. Then, naturally, they joined. Within days, dozens of others were dancing alongside her. Then hundreds. The phenomenon would later be known as the Dancing Plague of 1518, though plague feels almost polite for what was happening. This wasn't sickness in the usual sense. It was exhaustion, compulsion, and a slow collapse of control. People danced until their feet bled. They danced through pain, through heat, through hunger. Some collapsed. Some reportedly died of heart attacks, strokes, or simple exhaustion. And still, others kept moving, as if stopping was no longer an option. Naturally, the authorities stepped in to help. Unfortunately, their solution was more dancing. Local officials, believing the cure involved letting the illness run its course, hired musicians and even built a stage. Because if people are dancing uncontrollably, the logical next step is clearly to improve the atmosphere. Add music, maybe a bit of organisation. What could possibly go wrong? As it turns out, everything. The music only encouraged more movement. More participants joined. The situation escalated from deeply strange to catastrophically absurd. It was less a cure and more a well-funded disaster. Eventually, someone suggested a different approach, removing the dancers from the city and taking them to a shrine, where they were prayed over and mercifully encouraged to stop. Slowly, the dancing faded. What caused it remains unclear. Theories range from mass hysteria to stress-induced psychosis to ergot poisoning. None fully explain the scale or intensity. What is clear is this. An entire city watched as people danced themselves into collapse. And for a brief moment in history, no one, not doctors, not priests, not officials, had the slightest idea what to do about it. Which, in fairness, is still how most people would react today. In medieval Paris, bridges were not just for crossing rivers. That would have been far too simple. Instead, they were crowded, noisy extensions of the city itself, lined with houses, shops, and people who apparently felt perfectly comfortable living above flowing water, supported by wood and optimism. One such structure was the Pont au Change, a busy artery of daily life. Merchants sold goods, residents leaned out of windows, and crowds moved back and forth with the quiet confidence of people who had chosen not to think too hard about engineering. This worked, until it didn't. At some point in the Middle Ages, under the combined weight of buildings, people, and what we can generously call structural ambition, parts of the bridge gave way. Not gradually, not politely, just a sudden, decisive collapse, the kind that leaves no time for reflection, only for gravity to introduce itself properly. The timing, as always, was impeccable in the worst possible sense. Bridges tend to fail when they are empty only in fairy tales. In reality, they wait. They wait for crowds, for peak activity, for maximum inconvenience. And so, when sections of the bridge collapsed, people, homes and goods plunged into the river below in a moment of confusion and panic. Those who fell faced the immediate problem of water, debris, and the general inability to swim while being surrounded by pieces of what used to be your house. Those who remained above had the equally distressing experience of realizing that the ground beneath them was no longer entirely committed to being solid. What makes this disaster particularly medieval is not just the collapse itself, but the design philosophy behind it. Building houses on bridges was considered efficient, practical, a clever use of space. It also meant that every structural weakness carried not just foot traffic, but entire households stacked neatly on top. In other words, when something failed, it failed thoroughly. And yet, despite collapses like this, the idea persisted. Bridges continued to host buildings for centuries, because nothing says confidence quite like repeating the same risky idea and hoping the river behaves differently next time. History rarely records the names of those lost in such incidents. No grand speeches, no heroic narratives, just a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger isn't war or disease. Sometimes it's standing exactly where you thought you were safe, and discovering very suddenly that you were not. In medieval France, a feast was not just a meal, it was a performance. Status, wealth and power were displayed through overflowing tables, rich bread, endless wine, and the quiet expectation that no one would leave hungry, or at least no one important. And for a while, everything went exactly as planned. Guests gathered, plates were filled, bread was served in generous portions because bread was reliable, bread was safe. Bread was, in many ways, the least suspicious thing on the table. Unfortunately, this particular bread had other plans. Across parts of medieval Europe, outbreaks of poisoning occurred due to a fungus called ergotism, which infected rye and other grains. Under normal circumstances, it went unnoticed, ground into flour, baked, and served without ceremony. But when conditions were right, it transformed a staple food into something far less cooperative. At feasts like this, the first signs were subtle. A guest pauses. Another rubs their hands as if something feels wrong. Then the symptoms arrive properly. Burning sensations in the limbs, hallucinations, convulsions. People who had come to eat and socialize suddenly found themselves trapped in bodies that no longer followed instructions. Some claimed to see visions, others collapsed outright. What had begun as a celebration quietly shifted into confusion, fear, and the growing realization that the meal itself had betrayed them. There was no clear explanation at the time. No understanding of fungi, toxins, or contaminated grain. Just the uncomfortable suspicion that something invisible had turned against them. Some blamed curses, others looked to divine punishment. A few probably reconsidered their relationship with bread entirely. The cruel detail is that ergot poisoning didn't always kill quickly. For some, it lingered, causing prolonged suffering, damaged limbs, and a slow, uncertain recovery, if recovery came at all. Entire communities could be affected, not just one unlucky table. What makes this disaster particularly unfortunate is its simplicity. No grand mistake, no dramatic failure of engineering, just a crop, a fungus, and a kitchen doing exactly what it always did. And yet, the result was chaos. Because in the medieval world, danger didn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it arrived quietly, baked into something familiar, placed gently on a table, and passed from hand to hand without question. A feast, after all, is built on trust, and on this occasion that trust was poorly rewarded. In medieval France, ambition was not a quiet trait. It was carved into stone, lifted toward the heavens, and proudly declared for all to see. Cathedrals were not just places of worship, they were statements, proof that faith, wealth, and engineering could combine into something that made people look up and stay looking up. One such masterpiece was Beauvais Cathedral. From the very beginning, Beauvais had a goal: to be taller than everything else. Not slightly taller, not politely impressive, just undeniably, almost aggressively high. The builders pushed the limits of Gothic architecture, stretching walls thinner, vaults higher, and supports just strong enough to suggest confidence. For a while it worked. The cathedral rose, elegant and breathtaking. Light streamed through towering windows. Visitors must have felt a sense of awe, along with perhaps a faint instinct not to stand directly underneath anything too ambitious. Because the problem with pushing limits is that sometimes the limits push back. In 1284, part of the structure collapsed. Not a small crack, not a minor adjustment. A significant portion of the vaulting gave way, sending stone crashing down in a reminder that gravity, much like medieval politics, does not negotiate. The cathedral had reached too far, too fast, and the structure simply could not support its own confidence. Builders, being persistent by nature, did not take this as a final answer. They repaired it, reinforced it, and then, in a move that feels almost optimistic, they continued building upward again. Because clearly, the issue wasn't the height, it was something else. Probably, years later, additional sections, including the ambitious central tower, also collapsed. At this point, the pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. Beauvais was less a finished cathedral and more an ongoing conversation between human ambition and structural reality. What makes this disaster particularly medieval is not the failure itself, but the reaction to it. Instead of stepping back and reconsidering, builders doubled down. Higher, lighter, more daring, as if the solution to gravity was simply believing harder. Today, Beauvais still stands, impressive, incomplete, and quietly humbled. It remains one of the tallest Gothic structures ever attempted, a monument not just to faith, but to the fine line between brilliance and overconfidence. Because sometimes the desire to reach heaven ends with a reminder from the ground. A very sudden reminder. In the winter of 1362, along the coasts of the North Sea, people went about their lives with a quiet confidence that the sea, while dangerous, was at least predictable. Storms came and went, winds howled, tides rose, and then, eventually, everything settled back into something resembling normal. This time it did not. The event would later be called the Grote Mandrenke, a name that translates rather calmly to the Great Drowning of Men, which in hindsight feels like an understatement, because what arrived was not just a storm. It was a rearrangement of reality. The wind began first, strong, relentless, and unusually persistent. Then the sea followed, rising higher than expected, pushing inland with the kind of determination usually reserved for invading armies. Dikes, those carefully constructed barriers between land and water, held for a while. Then they didn't. Once the defences failed, the sea moved in without hesitation. Entire villages were swallowed. Fields vanished beneath salt water. People who had gone to sleep expecting a storm woke up to find the world had changed shape. In some places, there was no time to react. The water arrived too quickly, too forcefully, turning familiar ground into something unrecognizable. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. But the coastline was no longer the same. Thousands of people were gone. Entire settlements disappeared so completely that they would later be remembered only in stories. One of the most famous losses was the legendary trading area of Rungholt, often described as a kind of medieval Atlantis, though with fewer myths and more unfortunate timing. What makes this disaster particularly unsettling is its scale. Fires can be rebuilt from, buildings can be repaired, but when the sea decides to move the boundary between land and water, there is very little negotiation involved. Maps had to be redrawn, lives had to be restarted if they could be at all, and the survivors were left with a quiet, uncomfortable truth. The land they trusted had only ever been borrowed. The Middle Ages were full of dangers, war, disease, politics, but every so often, nature reminded everyone that it didn't need help. It didn't require armies or strategy, just wind, water, and the right moment. And on that night in 1362, the moment was perfect. Perfectly unfortunate. By the year 1190, the Third Crusade was in full motion, and among its most formidable leaders was Frederick I, Holy Roman Emperor. A man of immense authority, experience, and confidence, qualities that tend to grow when you've spent decades ruling an empire and not drowning in a river. Up to this point, things had gone relatively well. Frederick had successfully led a large, disciplined army across Europe and into Anatolia. He had defeated enemies, maintained order, and, perhaps most impressively, kept a crusading force functioning without completely falling apart, which, historically speaking, is already an achievement worth celebrating. Then he reached a river. The river in question is often identified as the Salif in modern-day Turkey. Not particularly famous, not especially wide. Certainly not the kind of obstacle one would expect to end the journey of a Holy Roman Emperor. And yet, here we are. Accounts differ slightly, as medieval sources tend to do, but the general outline is painfully consistent. Frederick attempted to cross the river, either by riding through it or after deciding that walking would be somehow less dignified. The current was stronger than expected. His armour, while excellent for surviving battle, proved less useful for buoyancy. He fell, and once a heavily armoured emperor falls into a moving river, the situation becomes difficult to reverse. Despite attempts to rescue him, Frederick I drowned, not in battle, not in a dramatic last stand, just a river, a miscalculation, and a very unfortunate reminder that water does not respect titles. The effect on his army was immediate and devastating. Morale collapsed. Leadership fractured. Many soldiers simply abandoned the campaign entirely, because if your emperor can be defeated by a river, confidence becomes a little harder to maintain. The grand momentum of the crusade, carefully built over months, quietly unravelled in a matter of hours. What makes this disaster so striking is its simplicity. No enemy ambush, no betrayal, just a crossing gone wrong. History often builds its legends around epic victories and heroic deaths. Frederick's end, however, reads more like a cautionary note. Even the most powerful man in the room can be undone by something as ordinary as a river, especially when wearing several kilograms of metal and a firm belief in his own invincibility. And somewhere downstream, the river continued as if nothing had happened, which in fairness it hadn't. In the year 1346, on the edge of the Black Sea, stood the fortified trading city of Kaffa, a bustling hub controlled by the Genoese Republic. It was the kind of place where goods, cultures, and unfortunately diseases all liked to mingle. Outside its walls waited an army of the Golden Horde, led by Jani Beg. The siege had dragged on, tense and frustrating, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. It was the usual medieval stalemate. Walls on one side, patience running out on the other. Then the situation changed, just not in the way anyone hoped. A disease began spreading through the besieging army. Soldiers fell ill rapidly. Fever, weakness, death. The kind of illness that didn't ask for permission and didn't leave much time for planning. Today, we associate it with the Black Death, though at the time, it was simply a terrifying mystery with a very clear outcome. Faced with an army that was quite literally dying around them, the attackers made a decision. A creative one. Using siege engines, they began launching the bodies of their dead over the city walls. Yes, not rocks, not fire, just corpses. The idea, according to accounts, was simple. If the disease was destroying their army, perhaps it could be shared. A generous, if deeply questionable act of medieval problem-solving. The defenders of Kaffa suddenly found themselves dealing not just with a siege, but with falling bodies carrying something far worse than the smell suggested. Inside the city, panic spread. Whether through direct exposure or the usual routes, rats, fleas, trade, the disease began to take hold, and as the Genoese merchants eventually fled by ship, they didn't leave empty-handed. They brought the plague with them. From port to port, the infection followed, moving across the Mediterranean and into Europe. What had started as a desperate tactic during a single siege may have contributed, at least in part, to one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. What makes this disaster particularly unfortunate is its unintended scale. A local problem, a short-term decision, a moment of siege warfare improvisation, and suddenly history shifts, because in trying to win a battle, they may have helped spread something far worse. Not immediately obvious, not instantly dramatic. Just a slow, relentless chain reaction that no one at the time could fully understand. A reminder that sometimes the worst consequences are the ones that travel quietly, long after the decision has been made. In medieval London, fire was not an unusual event. It was more of a recurring personality trait. The city was built largely of wood, tightly packed together, with narrow streets designed less for safety and more for efficiency. And by efficiency, we mean fit as much as possible into a small space and hope for the best, which worked until 1212. The event known as the Great Fire of London of 1212 began, as these things often do, with something small, a single flame, a minor accident, possibly a kitchen, possibly a workshop. Medieval records are not overly concerned with exact details, which is unfortunate, because this is exactly the moment everyone would like more clarity. What is clear is that once the fire started, it found itself in a city that had been, quite thoughtfully, designed to burn. The flames spread quickly from building to building, leaping across narrow streets with the enthusiasm of something that had been waiting for this opportunity. Roofs caught fire, walls ignited. Entire rows of houses became fuel within minutes, and with no organised fire brigades, no modern equipment, and very few effective methods of control, the city could do little more than watch and react. Panic followed. Naturally, people rushed through the streets carrying whatever they could, valuables, children, occasionally both at the same time. Others fled toward the River Thames, hoping water might offer safety. Unfortunately, when thousands of people have the same idea at the same time, safety becomes complicated. One of the most tragic aspects of the fire occurred on London Bridge, where crowds attempting to escape became trapped. With flames approaching from both sides, the bridge turned from a path to safety into something far worse. Many perished there, caught between fire and water, neither of which was particularly cooperative. The exact number of casualties remains uncertain, though chroniclers suggest it was significant. Entire sections of the city were destroyed, leaving behind charred remains and the quiet realization that London, once again, had underestimated its relationship with fire. What makes this disaster particularly medieval is how inevitable it feels. Open flames, wooden structures, crowded streets. It was less a question of if and more a question of when. And when it came thoroughly. Because in medieval London, fire didn't need much help. Just a spark, and a city ready to agree with it. In medieval towns, celebrations were taken seriously. Victories, royal visits, religious festivals, any excuse would do. Streets filled, banners waved, and temporary wooden platforms were erected so that important people could stand slightly higher than everyone else and feel appropriately important. Which brings us to the medieval tradition of building things quickly and trusting them immediately. During one such celebration in the city of Metz, a large wooden viewing stand had been constructed to hold nobles and dignitaries. It was impressive, elevated, crowded, and, as it turns out, structurally ambitious. At first, everything went exactly as planned. Music played. Crowds gathered below. the platform filled with finely dressed spectators who leaned, shifted, and adjusted themselves with the quiet confidence of people who assumed the ground beneath them had been properly considered. Then came the sound, a subtle creak, the kind that might be ignored at first, followed by another, slightly louder. At this point, someone may have glanced down. Someone else may have chosen not to. After all, no one wants to be the first person to panic at a celebration. The structure, however, had already made its decision. Without warning, the wooden platform gave way, collapsing under the combined weight of people, movement, and what can only be described as optimistic carpentry. Nobles, guests, and spectators fell in a sudden chaotic cascade of fabric, wood, and confusion. There was no graceful way to fall from a collapsing stage. The scene below shifted instantly from celebration to panic. People scrambled to move, to help, or simply to avoid becoming part of the situation themselves. Injuries were immediate, fatalities likely, and the carefully arranged order of the event dissolved into the kind of disorder that medieval planners rarely prepared for. What makes this disaster particularly unfortunate is its timing. Moments earlier, everything was festive, safe, controlled. Then, in a matter of seconds, it wasn't. No warning beyond a few creaks, no time to react. Just a sudden reminder that temporary structures are, in fact, temporary. And yet, events like this did not discourage future celebrations. Platforms continued to be built. Crowds continued to gather. Confidence, much like the structures themselves, was rebuilt quickly. Because in the medieval world, the show had to go on, preferably on something slightly more stable, but not always. Deep beneath the surface of medieval Europe, far from sunlight and fresh air, men worked in conditions that could best be described as optimistic. Mining was essential. Salt, silver, and other resources kept economies moving. But the methods were experimental. In places like Hallstatt, known for its ancient salt mines, workers carved their way into the earth with simple tools, wooden supports, and a level of trust in those supports that history would repeatedly prove misplaced. At first, everything seemed stable. Tunnels were dug carefully, or at least as carefully as one could manage underground with limited light, and a general lack of engineering theory. Wooden beams were placed to hold up the ceiling. The air was thick, the space tight, but the work continued, because it had to. Then came the warning signs. A faint crack, a shift in the earth, dust falling where it shouldn't, subtle signals that something overhead was reconsidering its current position. Experienced miners might notice. They might pause, but in a place where stopping meant lost income, hesitation was a luxury few could afford, and so they kept working until the structure above decided it had carried enough weight for one lifetime. When a collapse came, it came suddenly. There was no gradual failure, no polite announcement. Just the violent movement of earth and rock rushing downward, filling tunnels, crushing supports, and sealing exits in seconds. One moment there was space, the next there wasn't. Those caught inside faced an impossible situation. Darkness, dust, silence, broken only by shifting debris and the realization that the way out no longer existed. Rescue in most cases was unlikely. Without modern tools or organized response systems, there was little anyone above ground could do except listen, and eventually stop listening. What makes these disasters particularly grim is how common they were. They didn't make headlines. They didn't reshape borders or topple kingdoms. They happened quietly, underground, away from the attention of chroniclers. A tunnel collapses. A group of workers disappears. The mine continues because it must, and perhaps that is the most unsettling part. Life above ground carried on. Markets opened. Bells rang. People moved through their days, unaware or unwilling to dwell on the fact that beneath their feet, entire sections of the earth had shifted, taking lives with them in silence. In the medieval world, danger wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was just a ceiling, waiting its turn. In the medieval world, the sea was both a highway and a gamble. It connected kingdoms, carried goods, and made fortunes. It also had a habit of reminding people, without warning, that it was in charge. Merchants, sailors, and passengers boarded ships with a quiet understanding. If everything went well, they would arrive with profit, stories, and perhaps a mild sense of accomplishment. If things went poorly, well, the sea was not known for offering second chances. Routes across the North Sea and the English Channel were especially unpredictable. Weather could shift quickly, calm waters could become violent within hours, and medieval ships, while impressive for their time, were not exactly designed with comfort or safety as their primary concern. On one such voyage, a merchant vessel set out under what seemed like reasonable conditions. The wind was steady, the crew experienced, the cargo secured. Confidence, as always, was present. Then the weather changed. At first it was subtle, a stronger gust, a darker sky, the kind of shift sailors notice but hope will pass. It didn't. The wind intensified, waves grew larger, and the ship, once stable, began to move in ways that suggested it had lost interest in cooperation. Sails strained, ropes snapped, water found its way on board, as it tends to do when given even the smallest opportunity. The crew worked frantically, adjusting, securing, attempting to maintain control over something that was rapidly becoming uncontrollable. Then came the moment every sailor feared. The ship tilted too far, cargo shifted, balance was lost, and in a matter of seconds the vessel capsized, throwing everything and everyone into the sea. There was no time for careful escape. No orderly evacuation, just cold water, heavy clothing, and the immediate realization that survival now depended on strength, luck, and the ability to stay above the surface. Few managed it. What makes disasters like this particularly unfortunate is how routine they were. No famous battle, no legendary ship, just another voyage that began with confidence and ended with silence. The sea kept its reputation, and the people it claimed were rarely remembered beyond brief mentions, if at all. And yet, ships continued to sail, because trade demanded it, wealth depended on it, and hope, much like the ships themselves, was rebuilt quickly, often with the same designs, the same risks, and the same quiet belief that next time would be different. Sometimes it was, but not always. In medieval Europe, tournaments were meant to be controlled chaos. Knights in polished armour rode toward each other at high speed, armed with lances, while crowds watched from a safe distance, confident that this was all part of a carefully managed spectacle. And for the most part it was, until it wasn't. Tournaments, especially jousts, were designed to mimic battle while avoiding the inconvenient detail of actual death. Lances were sometimes blunted, rules were established, and participants were expected to demonstrate skill, not mortality. Of course, this relied heavily on everything going exactly according to plan, something medieval history rarely agreed to. One such event took place in Paris, where nobles gathered to watch knights compete in what was supposed to be a display of honour and precision. Among the participants was Henry II of France, a king who, like many rulers, believed he was perfectly capable of handling a lance at full speed, which, to be fair, he was. Up to a point. During a joust, Henry faced an experienced opponent. The two charged, lances struck, and in that brief, violent moment of impact, something went slightly wrong. Which, at that speed, is all it takes. The opponent's lance shattered, fragments splintered upward, one piece slipping through the king's visor and striking his eye. It was a small opening, a precise angle, the kind of accident that feels almost mathematically unlikely, until it happens directly in front of an audience. Henry II did not die immediately. Instead, he lingered for days, suffering from the injury, while doctors attempted treatments that, in hindsight, were more enthusiastic than effective. The court watched, the kingdom waited, and eventually the outcome became unavoidable. The king was dead. What makes this disaster particularly unfortunate is how preventable it almost was. Tournaments had rules, safety measures by medieval standards, and yet all it took was one splinter, one angle, one moment where everything aligned in exactly the wrong way. The crowd, which had gathered for entertainment, witnessed something else entirely, a reminder that even controlled violence carries risk, that even kings are subject to physics, and that sometimes the line between sport and tragedy is thinner than a wooden lance moving at full speed. Afterward, tournaments continued, of course, with adjustments, slightly more caution, perhaps a bit more awareness, but the core idea remained the same, because nothing says, "This is perfectly safe," quite like repeating the activity that just killed a king. In medieval Europe, walls were everything. A town without walls was a suggestion. A town with walls was a statement. We are safe, we are prepared, and nothing is getting in unless we allow it. Which was true, right up until panic got involved. During periods of conflict, particularly in regions like Flanders, towns often faced the threat of approaching armies. The usual response was predictable. Gates closed, guards posted, citizens gathered inside, and everyone waited behind thick stone with the quiet hope that the enemy would reconsider their life choices. Sometimes the enemy didn't even need to arrive. Rumours were enough. A scout reports movement. A traveller claims an army is nearby. Someone hears distant noise and decides it sounds vaguely like soldiers. The message spreads quickly, growing more dramatic with each retelling, until the entire town is convinced that danger is not just coming. It is already here. And then the gates close. From that moment on, the real problem begins. Crowds gather near entrances, people pushing to get inside before the gates are sealed completely. Guards shout orders. No one listens. Because in a moment of fear, order becomes a polite suggestion rather than a rule. Inside the walls, panic spreads faster than any army could. People rush through narrow streets, carrying belongings, searching for family, trying to find safety in spaces that were never designed for sudden, overwhelming movement. Markets overturn. Animals panic. Someone falls and suddenly there's no room to get back up. The crush begins. In several recorded instances across medieval Europe, more people were injured, or even killed, during these moments of internal panic than from any external attack. Trampled, suffocated, trapped in the chaos of their own attempt to survive. And sometimes, after all of this, the enemy never arrives. What makes this disaster particularly unfortunate is its complete lack of necessity. No siege, no battle, just fear, moving faster than reason, turning protection into danger. Walls, after all, are designed to keep threats out. They are less effective when the threat is already inside. Wearing the face of panic, moving through the streets, and convincing everyone that running is the only option. And once that begins, it doesn't take much. No weapons, no strategy, no army, just a rumour, and a crowd ready to believe it. By the mid-14th century, Europe had already proven quite capable of creating its own disasters. Collapsing buildings, questionable engineering, and the occasional fatal misunderstanding with a river. It was a chaotic system, but at least it was familiar. Then came something that required no mistakes at all. The Black Death arrived quietly, almost politely, through trade routes that had been used for centuries. Ships docked. Goods were unloaded. Life continued as usual. And somewhere in that process, something unseen began to move. At first, the symptoms were subtle. A fever, fatigue, a sense that something was not quite right. Then came the swellings, dark, painful lumps in the groin, armpits, or neck. These buboes gave the disease its name, bubonic plague. And once they appeared, the outcome was rarely encouraging. People fell ill quickly, and they died quickly. What made this disaster different from everything else in our quiet journey is that it didn't rely on timing, or poor decisions, or structural failure. There was no single moment where things went wrong, no creaking floor, no collapsing bridge. It simply spread from city to city, from home to home, carried by fleas, rats, and human movement. It moved with a quiet efficiency that medieval society was completely unprepared to handle. Trade routes became pathways of infection, communities became clusters of loss, and no one understood why. Doctors tried treatments, bloodletting, herbs, prayer, hopeful combinations of all three. Some people fled, believing distance would save them. Others stayed, believing nothing could. Both groups were often disappointed. In some regions, entire streets were left empty. Work stopped, markets closed. The normal rhythm of life, already fragile, simply paused. Not out of caution, but because there was no one left to continue it. Estimates suggest that between a third and half of Europe's population was lost. Numbers so large they become difficult to imagine, which is perhaps why chroniclers often focused instead on the silence that followed. What makes the Black Death particularly unsettling is its indifference. It didn't target the careless. It didn't reward the cautious. It didn't distinguish between rich and poor, careful or reckless. It simply moved, leaving behind a world that had to rebuild itself with fewer people and a much heavier understanding of how little control they truly had. No warning, no negotiation, just arrival, and then absence. Marco Polo arrives expecting cities, proper ones, stone walls, narrow streets, maybe a cathedral or two to remind everyone that God is watching, judging, and occasionally inconvenienced by trade disputes. Instead, he finds open land stretching endlessly in every direction, as if someone forgot to build civilization and simply moved on. There are no walls, no gates, no comforting sense that danger can be kept politely outside. Just the steppe, wide, exposed and brutally honest. And then there are the homes. The Mongols live in jurs, round tents made of wood frames and thick felt, sturdy enough to withstand fierce winds, yet designed to be taken apart in a matter of hours. To Marco, this feels less like architecture and more like commitment issues. In Venice, a man builds a house to prove stability. Here, a man builds something he can fold up before lunch. At first, it all seems temporary, almost fragile. But the illusion doesn't last long. He notices how efficiently everything functions. The jar isn't randomly placed. It's carefully arranged, with the door always facing south. The interior divided with quiet precision. The hearth sits at the centre, not just for warmth, but as the symbolic heart of the home. Nothing is wasted, nothing is accidental. Even the entire camp follows a kind of invisible order. Families cluster together, livestock positioned strategically, pathways forming naturally without ever being planned. It looks chaotic only if you expect it to look European. And that's Marco's first mistake. What surprises him most isn't that the Mongols lack cities. It's that they don't seem to need them. Their wealth isn't buried in buildings or locked behind walls. It moves with them, breathes with them, adapts faster than any fortress ever could. In Europe, power is measured in stone. How high you build, how thick your defences are, how long your walls can hold. Out here, walls are a liability. If danger comes, you don't hide behind stone and hope for the best. You leave, quickly, efficiently, without sentiment. Marco begins to understand, though perhaps reluctantly, that this is not a lesser way of living. It is simply a different one, designed for speed, survival, and control over distance itself. And somewhere between the endless horizon and the quiet efficiency of a camp that can vanish overnight, a troubling thought settles in. A people who can disappear this easily can also appear just as fast. If the landscape unsettles Marco Polo, the food finishes the job. In Venice, meals are structured, almost ceremonial. Bread, wine, fish, perhaps something delicately seasoned if fortune allows. Food is meant to be savoured, discussed, occasionally criticised. In Mongolia, food has a far simpler purpose: survival, preferably fast, efficient, and without unnecessary elegance. The first shock comes in a bowl. It's milk, or at least that's what Marco is told. But this milk has been fermented, stirred, and left to develop a personality of its own. It's called airag, made from mare's milk, and it carries a sharp, sour bite that feels less like a drink and more like a test of character. Marco takes a cautious sip. His face politely suggests betrayal. The Mongols, of course, drink it like water, and they drink it often. Then comes the meat. There is a lot of it. Lamb, horse, sometimes goat. Boiled, roasted, or simply cooked in its own juices with minimal interference. No spices, no elaborate sauces, no attempt to disguise what it is. The animal lived, and now it is dinner. End of story. Marco watches as pieces of meat are cut with knives and shared quickly, efficiently. There are no courses, no long pauses between dishes. Meals happen when they can, not when they are scheduled. Even more surprising is how the Mongols use every part of the animal. Nothing is wasted. Bones are cracked for marrow. Fat is valued. Organs are eaten without hesitation. To Marco, raised in a culture that often hides the less pleasant parts of slaughter, this feels direct, almost uncomfortably honest. But again, the logic is unavoidable. On the steppe, you do not waste what keeps you alive. There are no vineyards here, no orchards, no endless supply of grains. The Mongols live from their herds, and their diet reflects that reality with brutal clarity. Milk becomes drink, cheese and dried curds. Meat becomes sustenance, strength, survival. Even the way they eat reflects their lifestyle: quick, practical, adaptable. A meal might happen on horseback, during travel, or in the brief calm between movements. There is no fixed dining table, no expectation of comfort. Marco begins to understand that what first seemed crude is actually precise. Every habit, every flavour, every method has been refined not for pleasure, but for endurance. Still, as he finishes another reluctant sip of fermented mare's milk, one thought lingers. Back home, wine improves with age. Out here, the milk fights back. If Marco Polo expected to meet powerful rulers, he does. What he did not expect was that the true backbone of the empire has 4 legs, a mane, and absolutely no interest in Venetian etiquette. The Mongols do not simply ride horses, they live on them. From the moment Marco observes his first camp in motion, it becomes clear that the horse is not just transportation, it is an extension of the person. Men, women, and even small children ride with a confidence that feels unnatural to someone raised among canals and narrow streets. A Mongol child can sit a saddle before he can properly walk. By the time he has grown, the horse is less a tool and more a second body. Marco, meanwhile, is still negotiating his balance. The sheer number of horses is staggering. Each rider has several, switching between them to avoid exhaustion. This allows them to travel vast distances at a speed that would make most European messengers quietly give up. The empire stretches across continents, yet messages move through it with alarming efficiency. All because of these tireless animals. And then comes the detail that truly unsettles him. They drink from them. Not casually, not ceremonially, but practically. Mare's milk, already surprising enough when fermented into airag, can also be taken fresh. In harsher conditions, a small incision in a vein can provide blood, consumed quickly, without killing the animal. To Marco, this borders on the unthinkable. In Europe, a horse is valuable. Here, it is life itself, quite literally sustaining its rider. War only deepens the impression. Mongol riders can fire arrows accurately while galloping at full speed, turning their bodies in ways that seem to defy balance and reason. They do not charge in heavy formations like European knights, weighed down by armour and pride. They move fast, strike from a distance, disappear, and return before the enemy has fully understood what happened. It feels less like fighting an army, and more like being hunted by the land itself. Even rest does not separate them from their horses. Saddles double as pillows, reins are never far, and the bond between rider and animal remains constant. A Mongol without a horse is in many ways incomplete. Marco begins to grasp a difficult truth. This empire is not built on cities, walls, or even armies in the traditional sense. It is built on movement, on speed, adaptability, and the quiet, relentless endurance of horses that never seem to tire. And as he watches a group of riders vanish into the horizon with effortless ease, one realization settles heavily in his mind. You cannot defend against something that refuses to stand still. By now, Marco Polo has accepted that Mongolia will not behave like Europe. Still, there are limits. Or at least there were, until he begins to notice their habits around cleanliness. In Venice, cleanliness is a careful illusion. There are bathhouses, perfumes, flowing water, and the comforting belief that one is reasonably clean, even if the canals occasionally disagree. In Mongolia, the approach is different. Not careless, not ignorant, just built on entirely different priorities. Bathing, for instance, is rare. This is not out of neglect, but necessity. Water is valuable, especially in harsher regions, and the climate itself discourages frequent washing. Winters are unforgiving, and even a simple bath could quickly turn into a regrettable life decision. So instead of regular washing, the Mongols rely on other methods: scraping dirt away, airing out clothing, and simply enduring. To Marco, this feels like a quiet assault on everything he considers civilized. But again, there is logic behind it. Clothing, for example, is designed for function above all. Thick layers, often worn continuously, protect against cold and wind. Removing them frequently isn't practical. Washing them even less so. Over time, they carry the marks of daily life. Dust, sweat, smoke from the hearth. It's not pleasant, but it is effective. Then there are the rules that seem, at first, almost contradictory. Despite what Marco perceives as a lack of personal hygiene, the Mongols maintain strict beliefs about purity. Certain actions are forbidden. Washing clothes in running water, for example, can be seen as disrespectful to spirits. Polluting water sources is taken seriously, not because of germs, which remain a distant concept, but because of spiritual balance. It's not about being clean in the way Marco understands. It's about respecting the world around you. Even inside the jar, there is order. The layout is consistent, almost ritualistic. Items have their place. Movement follows unspoken rules. Step in the wrong direction, touch the wrong object, and you've done more than just make a social mistake. So while the surface appears rough, even chaotic, there is structure underneath, just not the kind Marco is used to. He begins to realise that cleanliness here is not about appearance. It's about survival, belief and efficiency. Still, as he adjusts his clothes for what feels like the 100th time, quietly wondering when he last encountered anything resembling soap, one thought lingers with stubborn persistence. Civilization, it seems, does not always smell the way you expect it to. By now, Marco Polo has learned to expect the unexpected. Still, nothing quite prepares him for Mongol women. In Europe, women of status are often confined, protected, supervised, occasionally consulted, but rarely entrusted with anything resembling authority. A noblewoman might manage a household, perhaps advise quietly, but power remains firmly in male hands. That, at least, is the comforting assumption Marco arrives with. Mongolia dismantles it within days. He first notices it in the simplest moments. Women ride, not delicately, not side-saddle like in Europe, but with full control. Fast, confident, entirely at ease. They manage herds, set up camps, and oversee daily life with a competence that feels less surprising over time and more unsettling to his expectations. Then he sees something even stranger. They give orders, not suggestions, not polite recommendations disguised as advice. Actual commands, followed without hesitation. In the absence of men, women take full responsibility for the camp. They organise movement, distribute resources, and ensure everything runs with the same efficiency Marco has come to associate with Mongol life. And no one questions it. This is not a temporary arrangement or a sign of desperation. It is simply how things work. The deeper he looks, the more the pattern reveals itself. Mongol society, built on movement and survival, cannot afford idle hands. Every person has a role, and every role matters. Women are not sidelined because there is no room for such inefficiency. When men leave for war or long campaigns, and they often do, someone must maintain the entire structure behind them. That someone is not waiting quietly in the background. Marco also notices the absence of certain rigid customs he took for granted. There is less emphasis on strict separation, less obsession with formal appearances. Women speak openly, act decisively, and carry themselves with a kind of practical authority that feels foreign, almost disruptive. Yet again, the logic is undeniable. An empire that moves as fast as this one cannot afford unnecessary restrictions. Strength is measured in capability, not in tradition alone. This realization leaves Marco in a quiet state of reflection. Back home, power is often displayed through titles, ceremonies, and inherited positions. Here, it reveals itself through action, through who can lead, who can manage, who can keep everything from falling apart. And as he watches a woman direct the dismantling of an entire camp with calm precision, issuing orders that are followed without question, one thought settles in with surprising weight. Perhaps it is not that these women have too much power. Perhaps Europe simply gave them too little. By now, Marco Polo has accepted that Mongolia prefers motion over permanence, practicality over ornament. Still, there is one question he cannot quite shake. How does any of this stay under control? In Europe, order is visible. It stands in stone. Courts, prisons, officials in robes, documents stamped and sealed with impressive seriousness. Law is something you can point to, something that occupies space. If you break it, there is a place waiting for you, usually damp and deeply unpleasant. In Mongolia, there are no towering courthouses, no long corridors of bureaucracy. Yet somehow there is order. Very real order. The answer, Marco discovers, is both simple and unsettling. The law travels. At the centre of this system is the authority of Genghis Khan, whose code, often referred to as the Yasa, governs behaviour across the vast empire. It is not written neatly in books for public reading. It is known, remembered, enforced with clarity that leaves little room for misunderstanding. And the punishments are persuasive. Theft, betrayal, disobedience. These are not met with gentle correction. They are met with consequences so severe that most people do not feel the need to test the boundaries twice. In a society built on trust and cooperation, especially during constant movement, even small acts of disorder can become dangerous quickly. The response is swift, direct, and rarely negotiable. To Marco, this feels harsh, almost excessive, but then he considers the alternative. There are no walls here, no prisons to hold people for long periods, no time for drawn-out trials or endless arguments. Everything must function quickly, decisively. Justice is not delayed because delay itself is a risk. More surprising, however, is what the law protects. Messengers, for example, are sacred. Harm one, and the consequences are severe beyond imagination. The same applies to envoys, to certain forms of hospitality, even to the treatment of animals in specific contexts. There is a structure here, one that values communication, loyalty, and the smooth operation of the empire above all. It is a system built not on appearance but on effect. Marco begins to understand that order does not require stone walls or elaborate rituals. It requires belief, and the certainty that those who break it will not get a second chance to reflect on their decisions. And as he watches a dispute resolved in minutes, without paperwork, without ceremony, but with absolute clarity, one thought settles in with quiet discomfort. Back home, justice may take its time. Out here, it does not bother waiting. By now, Marco Polo has grown used to having his expectations quietly dismantled. Still, religion. Surely religion must follow familiar lines. Structured, defined, carefully guarded. In Europe, faith is not just belief. It is identity, authority, and occasionally an excuse for unpleasant conversations involving fire. In Mongolia, it is something else entirely. At first, Marco struggles to even define what he is seeing. There are no grand cathedrals dominating the skyline, because there is no skyline to dominate. No fixed temples anchoring belief to a single place. Instead, faith moves with the people, just like everything else. The core of Mongol spirituality lies in shamanism, a belief system deeply tied to nature, spirits, and the unseen forces that shape daily life. Shamans act as intermediaries, communicating with spirits, interpreting signs, guiding decisions. To Marco, it feels less like organized religion and more like a constant conversation with the world itself. And yet, that is only part of it. What truly unsettles him is the tolerance. Within the Mongol Empire, multiple religions coexist, sometimes uneasily, but often without the violent insistence on dominance that defines much of Europe. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others move within the same vast territory, practicing their beliefs under the overarching rule of Mongol authority. At the center of this unusual arrangement stands Kublai Khan, who does something that would raise more than a few eyebrows back in Venice. He listens to all of them. Religious leaders are invited to court, debates are held, ideas exchanged. There is curiosity rather than immediate condemnation. Marco witnesses discussions that, in Europe, might quickly escalate into accusations, trials, and the unfortunate smell of smoke. Here they are simply conversations. This does not mean belief is weak. Far from it. The Mongols take omens seriously. The will of the sky, Tengri, is respected, feared, consulted. Decisions, especially important ones, may hinge on signs that Marco cannot fully interpret. But the presence of multiple beliefs does not threaten this system. It simply exists alongside it. That is what confuses him most. In Europe, religion often divides, defines enemies as much as allies. Here it functions more like another tool, respected, influential, but not always exclusive. Marco begins to realize that faith, like everything else in this empire, has been shaped by movement. It is flexible, adaptive, less concerned with rigid boundaries and more with practical harmony. And as he watches a Buddhist monk, a Muslim scholar, and a Nestorian Christian share space within the same court, none of them being chased out or silenced, one thought lingers with quiet disbelief. Out here even the gods seem to travel lightly. If anything finally convinces Marco Polo that this empire is not simply vast but terrifyingly efficient, it is not the armies, the horses, or even the laws. It is the mail. In Europe, sending a message is an exercise in patience and prayer. You hand it to someone, hope they are honest, hope they survive, and then forget about it for several weeks. If it arrives at all, it feels like a minor miracle. In Mongolia, it feels like a system. Marco is introduced to what the Mongols call the Yam, a network of relay stations stretching across the empire like invisible veins. At regular intervals there are posts, simple structures, often nothing more than a cluster of jurs, stocked with fresh horses, supplies, and men ready to move at a moment's notice. A messenger arrives, barely slowing down. Within minutes, he is gone again, on a fresh horse, carrying the same message, moving with the same urgency. The previous rider rests briefly, then prepares for the next task. The message does not stop. It simply changes hands. To Marco, this feels almost impossible. He watches as orders travel across distances that would take weeks in Europe, arriving in days, sometimes less. Entire regions respond to commands issued far away, as if the empire itself were a single organism, reacting instantly to its own thoughts. And then he notices something even more surprising. The system is protected. Messengers are not ordinary travellers. They carry authority, marked by tablets or symbols that grant them access to supplies, horses, and safe passage. To interfere with them is not just a crime, it is a serious violation of the Empire's lifeline. No one wants to test the consequences. The efficiency is relentless. Day and night, in all weather, the Yam continues to function. Snow, wind, darkness. None of it seems to matter. The message moves. Marco begins to understand why this matters so much. An empire this large cannot rely on slow communication. It cannot afford delays, misunderstandings, or lost instructions. Speed is not a luxury here, it is control. Without it, everything would fracture. And yet, the system works with remarkable simplicity. No elaborate bureaucracy, no endless paperwork. Just people, horses, and a shared understanding that the message must keep moving. As he watches another rider disappear into the distance, replaced almost instantly by another taking up the same path, Marco feels a quiet shift in his thinking. Back home, power often feels distant, delayed, uncertain. Out here it arrives quickly, sometimes uncomfortably quickly. By the time Marco Polo has spent enough days, weeks, perhaps longer, among the Mongols, something quietly unsettling begins to happen. Nothing shocks him anymore. The endless steppe, once empty and threatening, now feels almost logical. The gurs that seem temporary now appear efficient. The food he once approached with caution has become, if not enjoyable, at least understandable. Even the constant motion, the absence of walls, of permanence, no longer feels like chaos. It feels like design. And that is perhaps the most surprising realization of all. When Marco first arrived, he saw difference as deficiency. No cities? Then surely something was missing. No fixed laws in stone? Then surely order must be fragile. No familiar structure of religion, food, or daily life? Then surely it was incomplete. But Mongolia does not feel incomplete. It feels optimized. Every habit, every custom, every decision seems shaped by a single, relentless truth. Survival in a world that does not forgive weakness. Movement is not a choice, it is necessity. Efficiency is not preference, it is survival. Flexibility is not a virtue, it is the foundation of everything. And slowly, almost against his will, Marco begins to question his own assumptions. Back in Venice, walls mean safety. Here, they mean vulnerability. In Europe, wealth is stored, displayed, protected. Here, wealth moves, alive, breathing, grazing on open land. In Europe, order is enforced through systems that take time, layers of authority, endless processes. Here, order is immediate, direct, and rarely debated. It is not that one world is superior to the other. It is that they solve different problems. This realization settles heavily on Marco's mind. Because if everything he once considered civilized can be redefined so completely, then what exactly does civilization mean? He watches a Mongol camp at dusk. Fires burn quietly. Horses graze nearby. People move with practiced ease, each action part of a rhythm he now recognizes. There is no wasted motion, no unnecessary display, just life functioning exactly as it needs to, and for the first time, Marco does not see something foreign. He sees something effective, perhaps even admirable. As the night settles over the vast open land and the silence stretches farther than any city street ever could, one final thought lingers, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. The world is much larger than the one you were raised to believe in, and sometimes it works far better than you'd like to admit. Thousands of silent soldiers stand beneath the earth, perfectly formed, endlessly waiting, guarding a ruler who never accepted the idea of being alone. Not in life and certainly not in death. If this sounds excessive, that's because it is. But then again, Qin Shi Huang did not build an empire by doing things halfway. From the very beginning, his life was shaped by instability. Born into a time of constant war, where kingdoms rose and fell with alarming speed, he learned early that control was not a luxury, it was survival. By the time he became king of Qin, and later the first emperor of a unified China, he had already developed a mindset that would define everything he did. Nothing must be left to chance. He standardized laws, writing, currency, even the width of roads. Chaos, to him, was something to be eliminated, not endured. And death, quiet, unpredictable, impossible to negotiate, was perhaps the greatest form of chaos imaginable. So he prepared for it, not with prayers alone or rituals meant to comfort the living, but with construction on a scale that bordered on obsession. His tomb would not simply be a resting place. It would be an entire world beneath the ground, mirroring the one he ruled above it. Palaces, rivers, treasures, and, most famously, an army. An army that did not breathe. The terracotta army was not an afterthought. It was a deliberate solution to a very specific fear. If the afterlife was anything like the world he knew, then it would require protection, order, and absolute authority. Enemies might still exist. Threats might still emerge. And an emperor without an army was, in his mind, an emperor in name only. So thousands of soldiers were created, each one unique, each one standing ready in silent formation. Generals, archers, infantry, an entire military structure recreated in clay, designed to serve him eternally. It is easy to see this as madness, and perhaps part of it is, but there is also a certain logic buried beneath the scale of it. Qin Shi Huang did not trust uncertainty. He did not trust chance. If something could be controlled, it should be. If it could be built, it would be built larger than necessary. And as the construction of his underground empire continued for years, decades even, one thing became painfully clear. This was not a monument to death. It was an attempt to conquer it. If the idea of building an army for the afterlife sounds ambitious, the execution is something else entirely. Because this was not a symbolic gesture. Not a handful of statues placed politely beside a tomb, meant to suggest power. This was an army, structured, organized, and disturbingly real. Thousands of life-sized soldiers, each standing in formation as if awaiting orders that would never come. At first glance, Marco, well, not Marco this time, but anyone standing there centuries later, might expect repetition. Identical faces stamped out quickly, the way one might mass-produce something meant to impress from a distance. But that assumption does not survive long. Every soldier is different. Different expressions, different hairstyles, different postures. Some appear calm, others stern, some almost thoughtful, as if they were interrupted mid-decision and simply froze. It gives the unsettling impression that these are not statues at all, but people caught in a moment that refuses to move forward. The detail goes even further. Their armour is carefully sculpted, layer by layer, reflecting real military gear of the time. Shoes, belts, even the folds of their clothing are rendered with precision. These are not abstract representations of soldiers. They are soldiers, translated into clay with unnerving accuracy. And then there is the formation. This is where the illusion becomes strategy. Infantry stand at the front, positioned to engage first. Behind them, archers, some kneeling, some standing, ready to fire in coordinated waves. Chariots once stood among them, drawn by horses equally detailed, equally frozen in motion. Officers and generals are placed in commanding positions, their posture slightly different, their presence unmistakable. This is not random. It is a functioning military structure, recreated underground with the same logic that governed real battlefields above, which raises an uncomfortable question. Who exactly is this army preparing to fight? The answer is unclear. Perhaps enemies in the afterlife, perhaps symbolic threats, or perhaps it is not about fighting at all, but about maintaining order. Because for Qin Shi Huang, an emperor without visible control was no emperor at all. The scale of the operation only deepens the mystery. Thousands of figures, each crafted individually, each placed with intention. This was not the work of a single artist, or even a small group. It required an entire workforce, years of labour, coordination on a level that mirrors the empire itself. And standing among these silent ranks, one thought becomes difficult to ignore. This army was never meant to impress the living. It was meant to convince the dead. An army of thousands does not simply appear beneath the ground. It does not rise quietly, without effort, without cost. And as impressive as the terracotta army is, it carries a quieter, darker truth buried within it. Someone had to build it. And not just a few artisans working peacefully in a courtyard. This was a project on a scale that demanded an entire system. Labourers, craftsmen, supervisors, all working under relentless pressure to meet the expectations of a ruler who did not tolerate failure. The work began early in Qin Shi Huang's reign, long before his death. This was not a last-minute preparation. It was a lifelong project, unfolding in the background as he unified China above ground, while constructing a second empire below it. The workforce was vast. Skilled artisans shaped the figures, crafting faces, armour and details with remarkable precision. But they were only one part of the machine. There were also countless labourers, men who carried materials, fired clay, dug tunnels, and expanded the underground complex piece by piece. The conditions were not gentle, deadlines were not suggestions, expectations were not negotiable. The emperor's vision had to be realised, and hesitation was rarely rewarded. Mistakes could mean punishment. Failure could mean worse. There are accounts, whispered, debated, but persistent, that some workers never left the site, that once their part in the construction was complete, they were kept there permanently. Whether to protect the secrecy of the tomb, or simply because they were no longer needed, is unclear. What is clear is this: the silence of the army was built on human effort, and likely human suffering. And yet, even within this harsh reality, there is undeniable skill. The craftsmanship required to produce thousands of unique figures is staggering. This was not careless labour. It was organised, precise, almost industrial in its efficiency. Parts were created separately, heads, arms, torsos, and then assembled, allowing both consistency and individuality. It is a strange combination. Mass production with personality. Each face suggests a real person. Each detail hints at a level of care that feels almost contradictory to the conditions under which it was created. It is as if the artisans, despite everything, left something of themselves in the work. Perhaps intentionally, perhaps unconsciously. Standing before these figures, it becomes difficult to ignore the layers beneath them. Not just clay and structure, but effort, pressure and time, compressed into something that was never meant to be seen by the world. And that may be the most unsettling part. This was not built for admiration. It was built in silence, for an emperor who expected even the unseen to obey him. If the soldiers are convincing, the weapons complete the illusion, because these are not decorative props, not crude imitations meant to suggest power from a distance. The terracotta army was equipped with real weapons, functional, deadly, and ready for a war that, ideally, would never need to be fought. Archaeologists have uncovered swords, spears, crossbows, and arrowheads among the ranks, many of them astonishingly well preserved. Some blades still carry a sharpness that feels almost inappropriate after more than 2,000 years. It is less like discovering history and more like interrupting it. This is where the emperor's mindset becomes unmistakably clear. Qin Shi Huang did not believe in half measures. If an army was needed in the afterlife, it would not be symbolic. It would be operational. The weapons would not merely look real, they would be real. Each soldier was once armed according to rank and role. Archers held bows, infantry carried spears or swords. Officers commanded with the same authority they would have above ground. The organization mirrored reality so closely that it feels less like a tribute and more like a deployment. And then there is the precision. Crossbows found at the site reveal advanced engineering, with trigger mechanisms that demonstrate a level of craftsmanship far ahead of what many would expect. These were not experimental tools. They were reliable, repeatable, designed for efficiency, just like the army itself. Even the placement of weapons follows a pattern. They are not scattered randomly, but positioned exactly where they would be needed in formation. It suggests planning not just for appearance, but for function, as if the army might at any moment be called into action. Of course it never was, or at least not in any way the living can confirm. Over time, many of the original weapons were removed, lost, or deteriorated. Some were taken during ancient rebellions, others simply succumbed to time. But enough remains to tell a story that is difficult to ignore. This was preparation, not for ceremony, not for remembrance, but for conflict, even beyond death. Standing among these silent figures, knowing that they were once armed with weapons capable of real harm, creates a strange tension. The soldiers do not move, do not speak, do not act. And yet, everything about them suggests that they were built with the expectation that one day they might. And that expectation leads to a quiet, unsettling question. If an emperor prepares for war after death, what kind of peace did he expect to find? If the army is impressive, it is only a fragment of something much larger, something far more ambitious and far more unsettling. Because the terracotta army is not the tomb, it is the guard. Beneath the earth lies an entire underground complex built to mirror the world above. A hidden kingdom designed for an emperor who had no intention of arriving in the afterlife unprepared. At the centre of it all rests Qin Shi Huang, surrounded not just by soldiers, but by an imitation of everything he ruled in life. Ancient texts describe it in unsettling detail. Palaces were constructed underground, complete with halls and chambers meant to resemble the imperial court. There were storerooms filled with treasures, objects of value, symbols of authority, all carefully placed to ensure that nothing would be lacking. Even entire landscapes were recreated, including rivers and seas. But these were no ordinary rivers. According to historical accounts, they were made of mercury, liquid, shimmering, toxic. Streams and oceans flowing through the tomb, designed to represent the geography of China itself. Modern tests of the soil have revealed unusually high levels of mercury in the area, lending a disturbing credibility to what might otherwise sound like exaggeration. It is a detail that feels almost poetic, an emperor obsessed with immortality, surrounded in death by something that slowly poisons everything it touches. And yet the symbolism runs deeper. This was not simply about comfort in the afterlife. It was about control. Qin Shi Huang did not want to enter a world he did not understand, so he reshaped it, recreated it, ensuring that the structure of his power remained intact even beyond death. Above ground, he unified China. Below ground, he rebuilt it. The tomb, however, remains largely unopened. Not because it is forgotten, but because it is feared. The risk of damaging what lies within, combined with the potential dangers, mercury, structural instability, the unknown, has kept it sealed for centuries. So the emperor waits, surrounded by his army, his rivers, his carefully constructed world, untouched and unseen. And perhaps that is the most fitting ending. A man who sought to control everything now rests in a place no one dares to fully enter. His final empire remains intact, not because of his power, but because of hesitation. And as the earth continues to guard its secrets, one thought lingers quietly beneath the surface. Some kingdoms are built to last forever. Others are simply never opened. For all its precision, all its planning, all its obsessive attention to detail, the empire of Qin Shi Huang does not last. And when it falls, it does not do so quietly. After the emperor's death, the machinery of control begins to falter. The same system that once held everything together, strict laws, absolute authority, fear as a tool, now struggles without the man who enforced it. Power shifts, loyalties fracture, and what was once unified begins to crack under its own weight. Rebellion comes quickly. Peasants rise, former officials turn against each other, and the carefully constructed order collapses into chaos. It is almost inevitable. A system built on one man's will rarely survives his absence, and somewhere beneath all of this, the underground army waits, perfectly still, perfectly prepared, completely irrelevant to the world above. But the silence does not last forever. At some point during the upheaval, forces reach the tomb complex, not out of reverence, but out of opportunity. The empire may have fallen, but its treasures remain, hidden beneath the ground, waiting to be taken. What follows is destruction. Fires break out. Sections of the underground structures collapse. Wooden elements that once supported ceilings and chambers burn away, causing parts of the complex to cave in. Soldiers that had stood intact for years are shattered, broken into fragments, buried under debris. The army, built to defend an emperor in the afterlife, cannot defend itself in the present. Weapons are taken, materials are looted. What was once a perfectly ordered formation becomes, in places, a field of broken figures. Heads separated from bodies, limbs scattered, formations disrupted. It is a strange kind of defeat. Not a battle lost, not an enemy overcome, but a purpose undone. The army was never meant to face this kind of threat. It was designed for eternity, not for the chaos of a collapsing empire above. And yet, even in ruin, something remains. Many figures survive, partially buried, waiting. The structure, though damaged, does not disappear entirely. It endures in fragments, in silence, in a state of suspension between destruction and preservation. Above ground, dynasties will rise and fall, each replacing the last. Below ground, the army waits, broken, scattered, but not erased. And as history moves on, forgetting what lies beneath, one quiet truth settles into place. Even the grandest plans for eternity can be interrupted, sometimes by something as simple and as unstoppable as time. For centuries, the terracotta army remains exactly as intended, hidden, silent, undisturbed by the passing of dynasties above. Empires rise, collapse, and are replaced, each one rewriting history in its own image. And beneath all of it, the soldiers wait patiently, buried in darkness, their purpose long forgotten, until, quite unintentionally, they are found. In the year 1974, in the countryside near Xi'an, a group of farmers set out to dig a well. There is nothing remarkable about this. It is a practical task driven by necessity, not curiosity. Water is needed, and the land, as always, is expected to provide. Instead, it offers something else. As they dig deeper, their tools strike something hard. Not stone exactly, but not soil either. At first it is confusing. Then pieces begin to emerge. Fragments of clay, shaped, deliberate. A face, a torso. Something unmistakably human, yet not alive. What they have uncovered is not a statue. It is part of an army. Word spreads quickly. Authorities are notified, and soon archaeologists arrive, replacing shovels with careful brushes, curiosity replacing routine. What begins as a simple excavation turns into one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in modern history. And the scale becomes apparent almost immediately. Rows of soldiers appear, then more, then entire formations. What seemed at first like an isolated figure reveals itself as a vast, organized force buried beneath the earth. Each new section uncovered deepens the sense of disbelief. This was not supposed to be found. That is what makes it so striking. The entire complex was designed to remain hidden, to serve a purpose in a world beyond the living. And yet, here it is, exposed, studied, photographed, analysed. The silence is broken. Fragments are restored. Broken figures are pieced back together with careful precision. The army, once shattered and buried, begins to take shape again, not as it was intended, but as it is now understood. And with each discovery, the image of Qin Shi Huang becomes clearer. Not just as a ruler, but as a man whose ambitions extended far beyond life itself. The farmers who began this process could not have known what they were uncovering. They were not searching for history. They were searching for water. Instead, they found something far older, far more deliberate. An entire army waiting in the dark. And as the world finally looks upon these silent soldiers, one thought becomes impossible to ignore. Some things are not lost. They are simply waiting to be disturbed. Now that the army has been uncovered, at least in part, the real discomfort begins, because these soldiers do not feel like statues. They feel like people who stopped moving. At first, it is the scale that overwhelms. Rows upon rows of figures, each standing in formation, each locked into a role that has not changed in over 2,000 years. But once the initial shock fades, something far more unsettling takes its place. The faces. No two are exactly the same. Some look young, their expressions almost neutral, as if they are waiting for instructions that never arrived. Others appear older, with heavier features, a kind of quiet seriousness carved into their gaze. There are soldiers who seem alert, others distant, some almost tired. It creates an illusion that is difficult to ignore. These are not generic figures. They feel individual. Historians debate how this was achieved. Some believe moulds were used for basic structures, with details added by hand to create variation. Others suggest that real people may have inspired the designs. Faces remembered, interpreted, transformed into clay. The exact method matters less than the result. The result is presence. Standing among them, you are not looking at an army. You are standing inside one. Even the smallest details reinforce this impression. Hairstyles differ depending on rank. Armour is adjusted to reflect position. Officers stand with subtle authority, their posture slightly altered, their expressions more controlled. The hierarchy is visible, even in stillness. And then there is the colour, or rather, what remains of it. Originally these figures were painted brightly, vividly. Reds, blues, purples, all carefully applied to bring the army to life. But when exposed to air after centuries underground, much of this colour faded almost instantly, peeling away before it could be preserved. What remains is muted, a ghost of what once was. It adds to the effect. The soldiers look aged, worn, as if time itself has drained them of vitality. And yet their expressions endure, their forms remain. The individuality is still there, just quieter. Through all of this, one thing becomes clear. Qin Shi Huang did not want an anonymous army. He wanted presence, identity, control over not just the structure of his forces, but their very appearance. And as you move through these silent ranks, meeting the gaze of figures that were never meant to be seen, one thought becomes increasingly difficult to shake. They were not made to look alive. They were made to feel it. For all that has been uncovered, the soldiers, the weapons, the fragments of a buried empire, one truth remains quietly untouched. The emperor himself is still sealed away. At the centre of this vast underground complex lies the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, unopened, unexamined, and in many ways, still in control of how his story ends. Archaeologists have mapped the area, studied the surrounding structures, even detected unusual levels of mercury in the soil, but the chamber itself remains closed, not forgotten, avoided. There are reasons, of course, practical ones. The risk of damaging what lies within is significant. Exposure to air could destroy delicate materials in moments, just as it stripped the colour from the terracotta soldiers. There are also concerns about safety. Those ancient accounts of rivers of mercury no longer sound like fantasy, and no one is particularly eager to test them firsthand. But beyond the science, there is something else. A hesitation that feels almost respectful, or perhaps cautious, because opening that tomb is not just an archaeological decision. It is a confrontation with a vision so complete, so deliberate, that disturbing it feels less like discovery and more like interruption. Qin Shi Huang built his afterlife with absolute intention. Every soldier, every chamber, every detail was placed to serve him in a world beyond the living, and so far that world remains intact. Above ground, the terracotta army has become a symbol, studied, admired, reconstructed. It tells a story of power, ambition, and the human desire to outlast death. But it is still only the outer layer. The core remains hidden, and perhaps that is fitting. An emperor who spent his life controlling everything now rests in a place no one has fully entered. His final domain is untouched, not because it cannot be reached, but because it should not be rushed. Time, the one force he could never command, now dictates when, or if, his last secrets will be revealed. Until then, he waits, surrounded by his silent army, his imagined rivers, his carefully constructed world, still positioned at the centre of it all. And as the earth continues to hold its silence, one thought lingers, quiet, persistent, and strangely appropriate. For a man who tried to conquer eternity, remaining undiscovered may have been the closest thing to success. In medieval Paris, justice is not something that happens quietly behind closed doors. It is something you watch, walk through the streets on the wrong day, and it is always the wrong day for someone, and you will find a crowd already forming. Not out of curiosity alone, but expectation. Word spreads quickly when punishment is about to take place. A thief, a fraud, sometimes something worse. The details matter less than the spectacle, because that is what it is, a performance. The condemned is brought forward, often dishevelled, sometimes already injured, always aware that this moment is not just about them, it is about everyone watching. The authorities do not simply want to punish a crime, they want to remind the city what happens when order is challenged. There are no subtle messages here. A man placed in the pillory stands exposed, locked into position while the crowd circles. Insults come first, then thrown objects, rotten food if he is lucky, stones if he is not. The punishment is not just physical, it is social. Humiliation becomes part of the sentence, carefully designed to strip away dignity in front of neighbours, strangers, and anyone who might be considering similar mistakes. More serious crimes escalate quickly. Floggings take place in open view, each strike delivered with deliberate force, each one witnessed. Executions, when they occur, are not hidden either. They are announced, prepared, and carried out with an audience in mind. The goal is not simply to remove the offender, it is to imprint the memory into those who remain. Fear is not a side effect, it is the point. And yet the system presents itself as necessary. Paris is a crowded, growing city full of trade, movement and tension. Without visible enforcement, without these public reminders, disorder could spread quickly. At least that is the logic behind it. So justice becomes theatre. Officials play their roles with authority. The condemned plays theirs with little choice. And the crowd, perhaps the most important part, absorbs it all, carrying the message back into the streets long after the punishment ends. Standing there, watching a sentence unfold in front of hundreds of eyes, one realization becomes impossible to ignore. In medieval Paris, justice is not meant to be fair. It is meant to be seen. If justice in Paris is public, then crime exists in two very different worlds. There are the crimes everyone sees. Pickpockets working crowded markets, thieves slipping through narrow streets at night, brawls breaking out in taverns thick with smoke and bad decisions. These are loud, visible, almost expected. A stolen purse, a broken jaw, a knife drawn too quickly. These are the kinds of offences that end with someone in the pillory the next morning, bruised, humiliated, and serving as a warning to anyone watching. These crimes are simple, they are immediate, obvious, and easy to punish. Someone steals, someone sees it, someone reports it. Justice moves quickly, not necessarily fairly, but efficiently enough to maintain the illusion of control. But then there are the other crimes, the ones that do not happen in the open. Inside homes, behind thick wooden doors, things become less clear. Disputes between neighbours that turn into something darker, quiet acts of violence that leave no witnesses, agreements made in whispers, illegal trades, hidden deals, debts that are settled in ways no official ever records. These are harder to see, and even harder to prove. In a city where evidence is often limited to word against word, truth becomes flexible. Accusations can be influenced by status, reputation, or simply who speaks more convincingly. A wealthy merchant might avoid punishment entirely, while a poor labourer could find himself condemned on little more than suspicion. Justice, it turns out, does not weigh everyone equally. There are also crimes that blur the line between sin and law. Blasphemy, heresy, moral offences. These are not always visible, but they are taken seriously, especially when religious authorities become involved. What you believe, what you say, even what you are rumoured to have said can become dangerous, and rumours travel quickly, faster than facts often. This creates a strange tension within the city. On the surface, crime seems controlled, punished, displayed. But beneath that surface, there is a constant undercurrent of uncertainty. Not every crime is caught, not every accusation is true, and not every innocent person remains safe. As day turns to night, and the crowded streets grow quieter, one truth becomes harder to ignore. The most dangerous crimes in medieval Paris are not always the ones you can see. They are the ones no one can prove. If crime moves through the streets of Paris, then someone must follow it. Not with elegance, not with perfect efficiency, but with enough authority to keep the city from unravelling completely. These are the men tasked with maintaining order, the watchmen, guards and officials who operate in the space between law and chaos. They are not always respected, rarely admired, but absolutely necessary. At the centre of this system stands the authority of the crown. represented in Paris by officials like the provost. Under rulers such as Philip IV, the effort to centralize control becomes more visible. The city is too important, too crowded, too volatile to be left to its own devices. So enforcement becomes organized, at least in theory. The night watch patrols the streets after dark, carrying lanterns that barely cut through the shadows. Their presence is meant to deter crime, though in practice it often depends on who is watching and how much they care. Some take their role seriously, moving through alleys, listening for trouble, stepping in when necessary. Others are less motivated. Corruption is not rare. A coin slipped into the right hand can make a problem disappear, or at least move it somewhere less inconvenient. A guard might look the other way, a report might go unwritten, a suspect might be allowed to leave quietly. Justice, like everything else, has its price. Even during the day, enforcement is uneven. Officials rely heavily on local knowledge, neighbours reporting neighbours, witnesses stepping forward, accusations forming the basis of action. There is no modern investigation, no structured system of gathering evidence. Much depends on who speaks first and who is believed, and belief is not always fair. Still, the system functions, imperfectly, inconsistently, but enough to maintain a fragile sense of order. When crimes are visible, responses can be swift. Arrests are made, punishments delivered, examples set. But beneath that surface, the reality remains complicated. Those who enforce the law are part of the same city they are trying to control. They have loyalties, biases, and limitations. They are influenced by power, by money, by fear, just like everyone else, which creates an uncomfortable truth. The line between order and disorder is not as clear as it appears. It shifts, depending on who holds it. And as night falls again over the narrow streets, with watchmen walking their rounds and shadows stretching just a little too far, one thought lingers quietly. The people who enforce the law are not separate from the city. They are part of its uncertainty. Once a suspect is caught in Paris, the question is no longer whether something happened. It is whether it can be proven by methods that would make a modern courtroom quietly panic. There are no careful investigations, no forensic science, no long chains of evidence patiently assembled. Instead, truth is approached through testimony, reputation, and when those fail, something far less comforting. Interrogation. At first, it may seem straightforward. The accused is questioned. Witnesses speak. Neighbours may be called upon to confirm character. Honest, dishonest, troublesome, reliable. A man's past can weigh as heavily as the crime itself. If you are known for trouble, you are far more likely to be found guilty of it. And if you are not, well, that helps. Sometimes, but when certainty remains out of reach, the process takes a darker turn. Confession becomes the goal, and confession, unfortunately, can be encouraged. Torture is not the first step, but it is never far from it. Authorities justify it as a means of uncovering truth, though in practice it often reveals whatever the victim believes will make the pain stop. The logic is simple and deeply flawed. An innocent man will hold out, a guilty one will break. Reality, of course, is less cooperative. Pain does not discriminate. There are also ordeals, older methods still lingering in practice or memory, where the accused must undergo a trial by physical test. Survive it and perhaps you are innocent. Fail, and the conclusion is obvious, if somewhat inconvenient for the accused. It is not justice in the sense of careful reasoning. It is justice in the sense of reaching an answer. Quickly, the role of judges, often tied to royal or local authority, is to interpret all of this. They listen, decide, and move forward. There is little room for prolonged doubt. The system is not designed to question itself endlessly. It is designed to resolve, to conclude, to restore order, at least on the surface. And that surface matters, because once a verdict is delivered, it becomes part of the public narrative. A crime has been addressed, a sentence will follow. The city moves on, reassured that something has been done. Whether it was correct is another matter entirely. Standing at the edge of one of these proceedings, watching a man confess through clenched teeth, hearing witnesses speak with uncertain confidence, one realization settles in with uncomfortable clarity. In medieval Paris, truth is not always discovered. Sometimes it is decided. Once a verdict is reached in Paris, the next step is not quiet reflection. It is consequence. And in medieval Paris, consequences are designed to last, if not in the body, then certainly in memory. For lesser crimes, punishment often begins with exposure. The pillory and the stocks are common sights, placed deliberately in busy areas where crowds gather with little encouragement. A man locked in place becomes an object, not just of ridicule, but of participation. People shout, mock, throw whatever they have at hand. It is not enough that he is punished by the law. He must also be punished by the city. More serious offences bring harsher measures. Whipping is carried out in public, each strike visible, each one reinforcing the authority behind it. The body becomes a message, pain translated into warning. And when the punishment ends, the marks remain, a reminder that follows the person long after the crowd has dispersed. For others, the sentence is more permanent. Branding burns a symbol into the skin, marking the individual as a criminal in a way that cannot be hidden. The crime becomes part of the body itself, carried into every future interaction. A thief, a liar, a repeat offender. Whatever the mark signifies, it ensures that the past is never fully left behind. Exile is another option. Sometimes it is not the body that is punished, but the connection to the city. To be expelled from Paris is to lose more than a place. It is to lose protection, familiarity, survival. Outside the city, the world is less forgiving, and the absence of community can be as dangerous as any physical punishment. And then there are the final sentences. Executions, carried out with the same public clarity as lesser punishments, serve as the ultimate statement. Hanging, beheading, or worse, depending on the crime and the status of the condemned. The method itself can vary, but the purpose does not. It must be seen. Because punishment here is not just about ending a life. It is about reinforcing a system. Each execution is a reminder that authority is absolute, that defiance has limits, and that those limits are enforced without hesitation. But beneath all of this, a quieter truth exists. These punishments are not only about justice, they are about control. As the crowd disperses, the condemned either broken, marked, or gone entirely, one thought lingers in the air, unspoken but understood. In medieval Paris, the body is not just punished. It is used as a warning. For all the noise of public punishment in Paris, much of the city's true danger does not happen in daylight. It waits, in narrow alleys where light barely reaches, in taverns where conversations are lowered just enough to avoid attention, in rooms where doors stay closed a little too tightly. Here, crime is quieter, less theatrical, and far more difficult to control. Night changes everything. The streets, crowded and watchful during the day, become uncertain after dark. Lanterns flicker, shadows stretch, and the presence of the watch is never quite enough to fill the gaps. This is when thieves move with more confidence, slipping between buildings, targeting travellers, merchants, anyone careless enough to be alone. But theft is only the beginning. Gangs, loose groups rather than organised forces, begin to shape certain areas. They are not armies, but they are familiar with the streets in ways outsiders are not. They know where to disappear, where to strike, and perhaps most importantly, who to avoid. Conflict between these groups can erupt suddenly, turning quiet corners into moments of violence that leave little trace by morning. Then there are the crimes that leave no witnesses at all. Disputes settled in private, deals made and broken, violence that never reaches the ears of officials, because those involved have no interest in inviting attention. In a city where proving anything is already difficult, the absence of witnesses is often enough to let a crime vanish entirely, and sometimes people vanish with it. The system of justice, so visible in public, struggles here. It relies on reports, on accusations, on someone stepping forward. In the shadows, that rarely happens. Fear, loyalty, or simple practicality keeps people silent. It is often safer not to know, not to speak, not to involve oneself in matters that could easily turn dangerous. Even the watchmen, moving through the darkness with their limited authority and limited visibility, understand this. They patrol, they listen, they intervene when they can, but they are not everywhere, and they know it. This creates a second version of Paris, one that exists alongside the visible city, operating under different rules, less predictable, less controlled. By day, order is displayed. By night, it is negotiated, and as the city settles into uneasy silence, with footsteps echoing through empty streets and distant voices fading into nothing, one realization becomes unavoidable. The real test of order is not what happens in public. It is what survives in the dark. For all the certainty of punishment in Paris, there are places where that certainty begins to weaken, not disappear, but hesitate. These are the spaces of sanctuary. Churches, monasteries, sacred grounds where the authority of the law does not fully reach, or at least not immediately. Step inside and the rules shift. A fugitive, moments away from capture, might suddenly find protection simply by crossing a threshold. It sounds almost convenient. It is not. Sanctuary is not freedom. It is delay. A person accused of a crime can seek refuge within a church, placing themselves under the protection of the church rather than the city's officials. For a time they cannot be forcibly removed. Guards may wait outside, watching, patient but limited. The law pauses, not because it has changed its mind, but because it must, and that pause creates tension. Inside, the accused is safe, for now. Outside, justice waits, just as determined as before. Negotiations may begin. Confessions may be encouraged. Sometimes the individual is allowed to leave under conditions, often exile, abandoning the city entirely in exchange for their life. It is not mercy. It is compromise. The church's role in all of this complicates the idea of authority. In medieval Paris, power is not singular. The crown enforces law, but the church holds influence that cannot be ignored. When the two overlap, the result is not always clear. Who decides? The answer depends on the situation. Sometimes the church protects, sometimes it cooperates, and sometimes it simply delays long enough for the outcome to shift in its favor. For the accused, sanctuary can be the difference between immediate punishment and a narrow chance of survival. But it is not a guarantee. Those inside cannot remain there forever. Food must be provided, decisions must be made, and eventually the situation resolves. Often with the accused stepping back into the world, either to face judgment or to leave it behind entirely. And yet, even this limited protection reveals something important. The system of justice, so absolute in appearance, has boundaries. It can be slowed. It can be challenged. It can be negotiated, at least under the right circumstances. Standing outside a church door, watching guards wait while a man inside clings to his brief moment of safety, one thought becomes difficult to ignore. In medieval Paris, even justice must sometimes stop and knock. By now, it becomes difficult to ignore what truly holds Paris together. It is not fairness. It is not consistency. It is fear. Everything. The public punishments, the harsh sentences, the visible authority of officials is designed with one purpose: to prevent disorder before it begins. Justice is not simply reactive. It is preventative, and the most effective way to prevent crime in this system is to make the consequences unforgettable. So they are. A man whipped in the street is not just punished, he is remembered. A branded thief carries his crime across his own skin, a walking reminder for anyone who sees him. An execution draws a crowd not just to witness an end, but to absorb a lesson. Do not do this, or this will happen to you. It is simple, direct, brutally effective, and it works, at least on the surface. People think twice, then a third time. Small crimes may still happen, but the risk is always present, always visible. The city does not allow its residents to forget the cost of stepping out of line. But fear has its limits. It controls behavior, yes, but it does not eliminate desperation. Poverty, hunger, and survival push people toward crime regardless of the consequences. A starving man may steal knowing exactly what will happen if he is caught. Fear does not remove necessity. It only shapes the risks people are willing to take. It also creates silence. Witnesses hesitate. Victims remain quiet. To accuse someone is to involve yourself in a system that is harsh, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. It is not always worth the danger. So some crimes go unreported, some injustices unresolved, hidden beneath the surface where fear operates just as strongly. Even those in power are not immune. Officials must maintain authority, but they also rely on the same system of fear to support it. Lose control, appear weak, and the balance begins to shift. Order is not stable. It is maintained constantly, reinforced through visibility, through repetition, through consequence. It is a fragile equilibrium, and everyone knows it. As the city continues its daily rhythm, markets opening, trades continuing, people moving carefully within the boundaries set for them, one quiet realization settles in. Fear does not just punish crime, it becomes the foundation of order itself. By the end of it all, the system of crime and punishment in Paris begins to reveal itself for what it truly is. Not perfect, not fair, not even fully effective, but necessary. Everything you have seen, the public punishments, the uncertain trials, the hidden crimes, the men who enforce the law, the fear that lingers in every street, exists to hold something together that is always close to slipping apart. Paris is growing. It is crowded, loud, unpredictable. Merchants, labourers, nobles, clergy, travellers, all moving through the same narrow streets, all bringing their own needs, ambitions and conflicts. It is a city constantly on the edge of disorder, not because it is failing, but because it is alive, and life does not stay organised for long. So the system responds in the only way it knows how. It displays power. It punishes quickly. It reminds again and again what happens when the line is crossed. It builds an image of control strong enough that most people accept it, even when they know it is imperfect. Because beneath the surface, everyone understands the truth. Justice can be uneven. The powerful can escape what the poor cannot. The innocent can suffer, and the guilty can sometimes slip away. Fear may control behaviour, but it does not create fairness. It creates compliance. And yet without it, the alternative may be worse. Without visible punishment, without authority, without the constant reinforcement of order, the city could fracture. Crime would not disappear. It would simply spread, unchecked, unchallenged. The fragile balance that holds Paris together would begin to fail. So the system continues, not because it is just, but because it is functional enough. That is the uneasy compromise at the heart of medieval justice. It does not promise perfection. It promises stability, just enough to keep the streets moving, the markets open and the city intact. And as the sun sets once more over the rooftops, casting long shadows across streets that have seen both justice and injustice in equal measure, one final thought lingers quietly. In medieval Paris, order is never truly achieved. It is only maintained, one punishment at a time.